Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Paola Rivetti. I'm an associate professor in Dublin City University in Ireland and a member of BRISMES Council. Before introducing Professor Al-Ali and her talk tonight, I have a couple of announcements about BRISMES. So the first one is about our the call for paper for our annual conference. So it's on the website. The call for paper this year, well, actually for next year, is around ecological crisis in the Middle East. So you can find it on our website. So please go check and submit your paper proposal or panel proposal. The second announcement is about an event we will have next week on statehood and rethinking statehood in the Middle East and North Africa. Again, the announcement is on our website, so we hope to see you there. And finally, we are looking for 9 new council members. All members should have been received an email announcing this. So please nominate yourself, nominate your colleagues. We are very much looking forward to working with you. So it is a real honor to host Professor Al-Ali for our BRISMES Annual Conference. Professor Al-Ali is a longtime friend of BRISMES, and we are thrilled to welcome her and you all to what promises to be an important intervention and contribution to our understanding of the entanglements between resistance, the gender body, and queer politics. The relevance of Professor Al-Ali's talk, titled Feminist Dilemmas and Ambivalences, Gendered and Queer Perspectives on the Middle East, is clear to anyone who is observing the global rise of feminist movements and movements for bodily autonomy on the one side, and the advancements of far-right populism and authoritarian politics on the other side. How can we read the connection between the two? Is feminism our last hope to resist against authoritarianism? And if so, what type of feminism? What kind of liberation and emancipation can we imagine and practice when thinking about gendered and queer politics from and in the MENA region? These are some of the challenges that the years we are living through urge us to think about. No better person than Professor Al-Ali can enlighten us. Professor Al-Ali is the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at Brown University, where she is also the Robert Family Professor of International Studies and Professor of Anthropology and Middle East Studies. Her main research interests revolve around feminist activism and gendered mobilization, mainly with reference to Iraq, Egypt, Lebanon, Turkey, and the Kurdish political movement. Her publications include What Kind of Liberation? Women and the Occupation of Iraq, published in 2009 and co-authored with Nicola Pratt. Women and War in the Middle East, Transnational Perspectives, published in 2009 and co-edited with Nicola Pratt. Iraqi Women, Untold Stories from 1948 to the present, published in 2007. And Secularism, Gender and the State in the Middle East, published in 2000. Her co-edited book with Deborah Al-Najjar, entitled We Are Iraqis, Aesthetics and Politics in a Time of War, won the 2014 Arab American Book Prize for Nonfiction. Her most recent publication is a co-edited book with Denis Candioti and Catherine Spellman-Putz, titled Gender, Governance and Islam, published in 2019. Professor Al-Ali is on the advisory board of COHOL, a journal of body and gender research, and she has been involved in several feminist organizations and campaigns transnationally. Thank you, Professor Al-Ali, for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Paola, and thanks a lot for BRISMES to inviting me to give this year's annual lecture. Particular thanks to Amy and Neve. It's a great honor to be invited to give the talk, especially since I moved to the other side, the other side of the pond. I should say, though, that ever since I moved to the US, I feel more British because regularly people comment on my British accent, which is, of course, very funny. Anyway, I am going to share my screen now. So time has passed since I first imagined the content of this lecture. Rather than presenting you with a coherent argument or specific research findings, what I would like to do here is share my thoughts about feminist mobilization in relation to the Middle East. I want to briefly discuss shifting perspectives on gender and sexuality in the region, both against the backdrop of growing authoritarianism, as well as various forms of backlash with anti-gender discourses and homophobia being central to right-wing movements globally, as Paola already pointed out. I will conclude my talk with my reflections on the dilemmas trying to engage in transnational feminist solidarity while doing academic work. Throughout this lecture, I'll be sharing images. Some of the images have been part of my previous research, but I'm also using a few images from photo banks and media images, as well as artist images. And this title image is by the Iranian artist Turaj Sabarivand, who is inspired by traditional Persian book paintings to address the current situation in Iran. And trigger warning, I'm showing quite a number of images of men, specific kind of men, dictators. So my apologies for this unpleasantness. Recent developments in Iran should erase any lingering doubts concerning the centrality of the politics of gender in relation to various forms of contestation about the nature of the wider polity, whether in the form of enforced dress codes, the control of women's reproductive rights, the access to resources, but also the strict reinforcement of gender binaries and heteronormativity. I'm not an expert on Iran, and all I know and understand about the situation there mainly emerges from my conversations or listening to Iranian feminist colleagues and friends, and then, of course, looking at the media. And I'm sure that there are many of you in the audience who are much better informed and insightful about the ongoing protests and the incredibly brutal crackdown, excuse me, by the Iranian authorities. But I would like to take the occasion to express a sense of humility, inspiration, and respect for all those in Iran imagining and longing for a different kind of future, a different kind of government. At the forefront, we see women, we see girls and boys. It is also apparent to me that what we see is intersectionality in practice, given the even fiercer crackdown of protesters in the areas associated with ethnic minorities such as the Baluch and Kurds. I also see a case of, or an extreme case of what Denise Candiotti a few years ago has coined masculinist restoration. So the idea that if patriarchy as usual is no longer functioning because it has been challenged, it's sort of, trying to fight back even more violently. And I think that's what we're seeing here. I would also like to express my solidarity, though I realize that aside from signing letters and petitions, organizing teach-ins and webinars on Iran, there's very little that I can do in material terms. I'm also aware of the potential backlash in Iran, where accusations of Western infiltration has been, of course, one of the favorite instruments by the regime to discredit dissent. Now, my own research and activism on gendered mobilization in relation to Egypt, Iraq, Turkey, Lebanon, and the Kurdish movement has revealed the close relationship between political repression and the marginalization of minorities on the one hand, and the reinforcement of patriarchal heteronormative attitudes and policies on the other hand. The more intense the crackdown on women and LGBTQ rights, the stronger the rise of authoritarian and often militant and sectarian forces, and vice versa. This goes alongside a wider erosion of democratic and civic rights. In Iraq, following the outbreak of COVID pandemic, the prominent Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr blamed the Iraqi LGBTQ community for causing the coronavirus on his Twitter page. Sorry. He stated that one of the most appalling things that have caused this epidemic is the legalization of same-sex marriage, calling on all governments to repeal this law immediately. Since then, members of armed militia, including those loyal to the Shia cleric, have been targeting anyone perceived to be gay or transgender. Although the attacks of LGBTQ people had already increased since the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, the popular discourse and incitement by influential politicians like al-Sadr took a turn for the worse since the pandemic. At the same time, Muqtada al-Sadr and other political and militia leaders in Iraq have played an important role in increasing gender-based violence and challenging discourses around women's rights and gender-based equality. The attacks on both women and LGBTQ people might appear extreme in the Iraqi context, but different levels of restrictions, discrimination, and targeting are evident in numerous other countries in the Middle East. In Turkey, a government-appointed cleric also pointed to adultery and homosexuality as causes to bring illnesses, while President Tayyip Erdogan announced his plans to introduce a new constitutional referendum to protect family values against the homosexual propaganda with a law inspired by Russia's infamous 2013 anti-gay law. In Israel, politician Bezalel Smotrich, who describes himself as a proud homophobe and heads the far-right religious Zionism party, blamed one of Israel's COVID waves on the Tel Aviv Pride Parade. Yet, as we know, it is not only in the Middle East where we have seen an increased shift to more restrictive and conservative legislation and debates. In Europe, anti-gender and anti-feminist discourses and policies have also intensified alongside trans and homophobia. In the summer of 2021, a new law was adopted in Hungary, which made it an offense to promote sexual and gender differences to children in educational settings, films, or adverts. The law requires that human rights education courses in schools do not propagate consensual same-sex relations or the affirming of one's gender. Courses on sexual orientation may only be held when abiding by Hungary's constitutional identity and its Christian culture. In previous years, the Hungarian government systematically cracked down on gender studies and feminist scholarship, forcing entire courses to be shut down and contributing to the Central European University's decision to relocate to Vienna. There is no such thing as gender, exclaimed a high-level Hungarian politician when challenged about the government's ban on master's degrees in gender studies in 2018. Meanwhile, in the US, the overturning of Roe versus Wade brings into sharp relief what many of us have tried to articulate for a while now. The US is not a beacon of women's rights and women's freedom, nor is the US an exception to the increasing onslaught against women, particularly poor women and women of color. Denying women the right to and choice of abortion, that is, denying them their bodily autonomy, is part of a larger global struggle for control and domination by authoritarian regimes and extreme right-wing political groups. When it comes to homophobia and transphobia, the US is evidently also at the forefront of a trend whereby the moral panic stoked by the far right trickles into mainstream conservatism. Following the passage of Florida's Don't Say Gay law and a wave of other homophobic and transphobic legislation throughout the country, current right-wing rhetoric has focused on accusations of grooming. In the UK, anti-trans rhetoric arguing that sex is immutable and gender identity is not valid has also been gaining concerning credibility at the expense of both trans people's civil liberties and children's rights. The Ida Hood Forum 2021, the Minister for Equality stated in contradiction with international human rights standards with respect to the rights of trans people, we do not believe in self-identification. Now, you might wonder why I spend so much time talking about developments in Europe and the US when giving an annual lecture to the British Middle East Studies Association. But my point here is that it is really about time we rethink our previous ways of categorizing the world. It is indeed globally that we have seen an alignment of anti-gender, anti-feminist, and anti-LGBTQ attitudes and policies amongst politicians, movements, and activists on the illiberal to extreme right-wing spectrum. In the forthcoming volume, I'm co-editing with my colleagues Tunay Altay at Humboldt University and Katharina Gallo at Brown. We attempt to conceptualize the broad spectrum of right-wing politics as manifested in authoritarian, illiberal, right-wing, and radical movements with a range of different empirical case studies from the Middle East and Europe. While Europe and the Middle East tend to be looked at separately within the existing literature, we explore both regions given their interconnectedness, particularly through migration. At the same time that we are witnessing a shift towards anti-gender and anti-feminist and homophobic attitudes and policies globally, we have also been experiencing a pandemic of gender-based violence intensified since the beginning of COVID-19. Now, without wanting to justify gender-based violence in any way, feminist scholars have highlighted that the experiences of injustice and exploitation at the hands of state and non-state actors and institutions historically and cross-culturally tended to contribute to men lashing out and becoming more likely perpetrators of violence against women. Homes are often not safe for women and girls, but are also frequently unsafe for LGBTQ+ people who are forced to stay in closer proximity to potentially homophobic and transphobic family members. Complicating feminist initiatives in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic in countries of the Middle East has been the tension between state-led feminist initiatives, often referred to as state feminism, and independent feminist organizations and initiatives. Historically, one of the challenges for women's rights activists in the Middle East has been to avoid co-option by the respective authoritarian regimes' modernizing policies, of which a form of state feminism, and we can sort of actually debate whether it's a correct term, a form of state feminism, or supposedly state feminism, has been a key element. Authoritarian regimes have implemented measures to increase gender equality and social justice, as long as these were perceived to be harmless to the regime and the political status quo. And we've seen this most conspicuously in Turkey under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, in Iran under Mohammad Reza Shah, or in Tunisia with Habib Bourguiba's radical legal reform of the personal status code governing marriage, divorce, child custody, and inheritance, and more recently, of course, Ben Ali's politics of secular reformism to consolidate his political authoritarianism. In the context of one-party dictatorships, as in many countries in the region, it was difficult for women's rights activists to operate independently of state structures. In Egypt, some women's rights activists collaborated with Suzanne Mubarak's National Council for Women, which played a high-profile role in promoting legal reforms. Despite the fact that women's groups on the ground had been working and lobbying for years for these changes, they came to be considered and called Suzanne's laws or Susie's laws. And in the post-Mubarak period, there have been attempts to reverse them to signal a break from the past. Now, co-option has definitely been an issue and a challenge for feminist activists in the past, but it's been a real challenge, but there's no doubt that feminist activists are often discredited in an unfair manner. I mean, this accusation of corruption plus the accusation of aping or imitating the West have been the main ways to discredit feminist activists historically and up to the present day. But I suggest that we need to reevaluate and engage in a much more nuanced analysis and debates about the historical relationship between regional feminist movements and the modernizing policies of authoritarian states. It is crucial to learn lessons from the past, as the issue of alliances is central for feminist activists in the Middle East today. Calls for increased centralized government interventions, and in some cases even calls for the military to get involved to tackle COVID-19 particularly, have been clearly problematic in contexts where governments and militaries are part of the problem in terms of maintaining or even exacerbating structural inequalities, different forms of injustice and violence. Women across the region have not been able to rely on the state and state-related institutions like the police and the judiciary to protect them from gender-based and sexual violence. In contrast, government-related institutions, the military and sub-state militias have been trying to control women's bodies, mobility, dress codes, personal relations, sexuality, trying to reinforce patriarchal, heteronormative gender regimes, toxic masculinities, and authoritarian politics, whether religious or secular. One question that feminists throughout the Middle East, and in line with my previous argument, increasingly, I would say globally, have to ask themselves is how much their advocacy and strategy and their strategies should focus on criticizing the consistently gender-blind policies, interventions, and relief programs of governments, and whether their strategy should be to influence governments by trying to get involved without being co-opted by them. In some contexts, collaborations and joint initiatives might be possible and even effective, whether they're strategic, temporary alliances or more lasting ones. But joint ventures with authoritarian regimes in other contexts might not only mean having to cross red lines, but could also lead to the further discrediting of feminist activists and organizations who are already often under pressure and under attack. Now, in context of authoritarian repressive regimes such as Iraq, Egypt, and Turkey, or severely incompetent and corrupt regimes like Lebanon, for example, should feminist activists be involved in decision-making processes and demand seats at the table? Or should they try to stay far away from these tables associated with corruption, repression, securitization of bodies, and sexualities? Now, in my view, in the context of these specific countries, working around instead of with governments might be the wiser approach. However, I would like to stress that these are difficult and complex decisions that need to be made on a case-by-case basis and cannot be categorically assessed, especially not from the outside, without knowing the complex internal, local, and national dynamics, pressures, and challenges. Some feminist activists and researchers have commented that the conditions of the pandemic might have a silver lining in terms of the opportunities it might have opened up. The Lebanese academic and activist Lina Abu Habib puts it the following way, and I quote, "I'd like to think that some of its effects are positive and to a large extent irreversible. The abysmal failure of our states to protect women and curb gender-based violence can no longer be hidden or excused. Violence against women and girls can no longer be ignored and is already fully recognized as a pandemic in its own right. And the COVID-19 pandemic has probably shown us the human cost of failing to recognize and address this pandemic, this other pandemic of gender-based violence. Unequal gender relations within families and the burden of care work carried by women and girls have finally entered the realm of social and public debates. Several feminist organizations are already working towards public policies which are not only aware of the opportunities of the opportunity cost of care work, but which also seek to distribute that cost. Moreover, and perhaps more importantly, the silencing and invisibilizing of queer people, sex workers, and other groups is no longer possible. What the crisis has shown us is that feminist organizing is not only alive and kicking, but also creative and resilient and saves lives. Abu Habib's assessment might appear overly optimistic, given the long history of missed opportunities and the tendency to marginalize women and gender issues, as well as LGBTQI+ communities, not only in the Middle East, but more broadly globally in the context, especially of economic and political crises. And to my mind, there's also a risk that the exact opposite of what Abu Habib predicts might happen. Gender-based claims and injustices might be yet again pushed to the side and into the internal waiting rooms of what is always presented to us as priorities and wider issues. Feminists will be particularly challenged not to be marginalized or worse, be threatened by the right-wing populism and militant ethno-nationalism that seem to have been exacerbated by the pandemic and might increase as part of the backlash against, on the other hand, growing global feminist and also anti-racist mobilization. Throughout the Middle East, demands by protesters during the revolutionary demonstrations preceding the epidemic are resurfacing, now with even greater force and justification. The COVID-19 pandemic has been highlighting pre-existing intersectional gendered vulnerabilities, patriarchal violence, and toxic forms of masculinity. The pandemic has also exacerbated the growth of authoritarian politics at state and sub-state levels, increasingly linked with nationalist rhetoric and policies. Yet we have also seen the persistence of various forms of feminist activism in the region. Obviously, it is important not to minimize the devastating impact of repressive policies and crackdown of dissent. Iran, Turkey, and Egypt immediately come to mind. Also, we need to avoid homogenizing feminisms in the region and be mindful of the specific dynamics at play in different empirical contexts. However, I would like to put forward a few observations. First, I think it is important to stress the heterogeneity of forms of feminism in the Middle East. We find on sort of the one end of the spectrum, liberal rights-based feminism that is sometimes linked to state feminism, but not necessarily. And that tends to exist in many contexts alongside a progressive continuum of more leftist-leaning feminisms that are concerned with political economy. There is a spectrum as well of secular and religious forms of feminisms, including a range of Islamic feminisms and gender-based mobilization as well within Islamist organizations. We find across the region that feminist initiatives and organizations are local, national, and transnational in scope, and there are a range of different scopes here. We also see different modes of organizing, and especially amongst the younger generation, a shift away from the sort of prevailing model of NGOs, which was very prevalent when I started my research in the 90s in Egypt. And alongside, there are also different funding models starting with state-funded, externally funded, but also self- and community-funded initiatives. There are feminist organizations and initiatives that are single-issue focused, others that very specifically focus on gender-based violence, gender-related injustices, patriarchy as a power configuration, but increasingly, and I would say especially amongst the younger generation, increasingly an intersectional approach. And what I mean here, of course, I'm based in the US, and in the US, intersectionality, as developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, very much relates to gender, race, and class. But when we think about intersectionality in the Middle East, what I mean here is the recognition that aside from patriarchy, there are different kinds of power configurations that impact people's lives. So, you know, when I did research in Iraq, clearly patriarchy was an issue, class was an issue, but also sectarianism. So the kind of power configurations that are linked to, you know, different religious denominations, and also, of course, ethnic tensions. I'm thinking particularly Arab and Kurd here. So we also see a generational shift in many contexts in the region. One of several aspects of this difference in generational sensibilities and politics is that the issue of sexuality and the challenge of heteronormativity has not only become less of a taboo issue, although there are huge variations on this amongst feminists in the region. And we have also seen a growing number of queer feminist activists and organizations. Riva Sayek, founder and editor-in-chief of the online journal Kuhl, a journal of body and gender research, and myself have previously discussed the tensions and divergent paths of feminist and LGBTQ activism in the region. Historically, many feminist activists and organizations have frequently been complicit in homophobia and reinforcing heteronormativity. When I did research for my PhD in the mid-1990s in Cairo, any reference I made to LGBTQ rights were largely met with disdain. I mean, not amongst everyone, but there was sort of the sense that that was, you know, pursuing a Western agendas. And this was, of course, a time when authenticity was a buzzword evoked by the Egyptian intelligentsia and political elite, but also by some activists. During the heydays of the Mubarak era, allegations of aping the West were used systematically to discredit feminist activists, who in turn frequently had to resort to reasserting the anti-Western and authentic Egyptian cultural backgrounds and positions. However, the accusation of being too Western was used strategically. Egyptian intellectuals, activists, and politicians have always been selective in their appropriations and repudiations of what they perceive to be Western ideas and values. During my research on the Egyptian feminist movement in the mid-1990s, this phenomenon was not only visible amongst Islamist and conservative nationalist forces, but was even if to a lesser extent, also noticeable among some feminist activists who displayed a great degree of selectivity with respect to the question of what was culturally legitimate in terms of women's struggle for equality and emancipation. And I mean, that was understandable in this specific context. And of course, we also know a few years later, in 2001, the infamous Queen Boat case, also known as Cairo 52, revealed the complicity not only of some human rights, but also some feminist activists in perpetuating what ended up to be homophobic discourses and policies. And for those of you who are not familiar with the incident, because it's now quite a while back, and I realize that not everyone is aware. So the Queen Boat was a floating nightclub on the Nile, popular amongst gay men. And in May of 2001, the Egyptian police raided the boat and arrested 52 gay men who were exposed to humiliating treatment in the media and in the courts. And my colleague and friend Nicola Pratt illustrates in her insightful analysis of the way different political actors instrumentalized and reacted to the Queen Boat incident, the already embattled Egyptian human rights community became divided over how to respond to the case. And her article shows how the Queen Boat case not only delegitimized homosexuality, but actually also weakened civil society's ability to challenge the regime's authoritarianism and wider public dissent in the name of protecting Egyptian sovereignty. More recently, a new generation of feminists in Egypt and of course elsewhere in the region has emerged that appears to be very interested and appreciative of former generations of feminist activists. They have been eager to learn about the long history of feminist activism in Egypt and are aware of previous struggles and challenges. Yet, unlike many of the feminists of previous generations, they do not seem to carry the same burden of wanting to assert their authenticity or the worry of being accused of imitating the West. This is despite the fact that there has been a fierce backlash against feminist activism in the post-Mubarak period. This time, not only merely because of being discredited for being alien to Egyptian culture and aping Western culture, but also discredited for the state feminism promoted by Susi Mubarak. Under President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, feminist organizations are once more targeted for their alleged links to Western funders in the wider context of the crackdown and repression of civil society and political opposition. Yet several of the organizations of younger feminist activists are embracing a queer activist politics, rejecting the heteronormative and occasionally homophobic strands of earlier generations of feminists, while simultaneously distancing themselves from a neoliberal identity politics and a rights and visibility-focused LGBT activism. And that trend I've also seen very much in the context of Lebanon and in Turkey as well. Increasingly, feminist and queer and LGBTQ activists in the region are rejecting the idea that gender and sexuality are side issues and a luxury in the context of war, poverty, displacement, sectarian tensions, and political corruption. Queer feminists also challenge the notion that their gender nonconformity or sexual orientations and identities should be the sole focus of their politics, and that visibility and recognition are the main aims of their struggle. Queer feminists in the region share the conviction that the activism and politics needs to make the connection with the discrimination and marginalization linked to a set of inequalities, the Israeli occupation in the Palestinian context, the marginalization of migrant domestic workers and Syrian refugees in Lebanon, or the issue of state repression against Kurds and other ethnic and religious minorities in Turkey. Here, we also see a difference between queer feminist perspectives and the more liberal rights-based visibility and pride-focused LGBT activism that is often not only, but frequently gay, cis, male-dominated. Yet, queer feminist perspectives are diverse as well, and tensions revolve around several axes and questions. What role does class play, if any? How to relate to the male-dominated LGBT activism and approaches? Which alliances, even if temporary, are politically acceptable? And what are red lines in terms of working across political differences? And I should also say that, of course, while there has been an emergence of queer feminist organizations and activism, and also, as I would say, scholarship, some context in some countries, so Iraq, for example, that has not been possible for obvious reasons, and it's still, impossible for feminists in Iraq to really address either sexuality more broadly or heteronormativity, or it's very difficult. In terms of scholarship on gender and sexuality, we have also seen significant shifts. Researchers and activists working in and on the Middle East have objected to the ways an earlier queer scholarship perceived the Middle East as well as other global Southern contexts as areas to generate local and native data to match with Western, that is mainly US-generated queer theory. Instead, their work shows that the specific historical empirical conditions, subversion, social movements, and effective economies generate innovative and original theory itself. While a critique of US imperialism and neoliberalism is key to some analysis, particularly those building on just Pierre-Poir's notion of homonationalism, a growing number of scholars have engaged in analysis that defy US centrism, while also de-exceptionalizing queer precarity within the Middle East. Walal Qaisia's excellent work comes to mind here. She develops a politics of decolonial queering that crucially rejects the hierarchization of struggles and tries to avoid prioritizing either the Palestinian struggle for liberation or the struggle against the heteropatriarchal nation state. I'm also thinking about Ghassan Moussawi's contribution and conceptualization of disruptive situations in his excellent inquiry and analysis of LGBTQ lives and strategies in Beirut. Moussaoui recounts what he calls al-wad, a situation where precarity and liminality are normative and always already disruptive. The idea of queer methodology emerging from within the Middle East is also at the heart of Evren Savci's ethnographic study of sexual politics in contemporary Turkey. Here the author is interested in the productive paradox that neoliberal Islam posits to queer studies, as the field has taken significantly different critical and epistemological positions vis-à-vis the disparate aspects of this political, economic, religious order. In other words, scholarship tends to either focus on conservative Islam or neoliberal politics, but does not consider the conjuncture of the two, which requires careful historicizing and attention to complex empirical realities. Savci nuances and complicates the focus on Islamophobia and Orientalism, engages in depth with the Turkish government's ideology and politics, while also challenging homogenized constructs of the West. Now, just as feminist scholarship is not necessarily about women and gender, but provides a critical analytical lens and methodology, so is queer theory not necessarily about queer people or even sexuality. To my mind, some of the most interesting and politically significant interventions within the broad field of gender studies with reference to the Middle East in recent years has been produced by scholars employing a queer feminist lens. Now it is beyond the scope of this paper to list everyone. There's the wide range. I've already mentioned a few scholars, but I would like to mention the recently published book by Maya Mikdashi entitled Sectarianism, Sovereignty, Secularism, and the State in Lebanon. She has pioneered the idea of queering citizenship and sovereignty and has reminded us that queer theory can be a methodology, a way of interrogating normative practices of and assumptions about race, class, the state, and the body. Queering both citizenship and sectarianism in the context of personal status laws in Lebanon allows Mikdashi to not only reveal complex, messy, and occasionally contradictory legal, bureaucratic, and social layers, but also bring to light the tensions between prevailing discourses and practices. She has developed the term sectarianism, denoting the ways how gender, sexuality, and sect structure legal and bureaucratic systems, and how citizenship and statecraft are performed intersectionally in relation to sect and sexuality. Crucially, outside of academia, queer feminist activists in the region and in the diaspora have engaged in queer theorizing and the decolonization of knowledge production. These initiatives and expressions often bridge activist and academic discourses, as many activists are well-read and familiar with feminist and queer theory. Riva Saik shares the idea behind the journal Kohol. On the academic side of things, I was interested in the question of who has the power and the access to publish in certain places. It's not so much about age, but more about power. Of course, it is linked, but it's not the same. Students do not have access like professors. The myth is that if you're not an academic, you cannot contribute to knowledge production, and your role is to work with communities and give them food. Kohol is a way of saying, no, this knowledge that is living on an everyday basis is valuable. There are different dynamics within and outside academia. Kohol, similar to other feminist projects in the region, challenges the binaries between academia and activism in relation to knowledge production and theorizing. Amongst the activists I talked to, there's a strong awareness about the tendency to privilege Western academic knowledge and theories while treating regional knowledge and people's experiences as raw data. Now, the overall sense I would like to share here is that feminist and particularly queer feminist scholars and activists working in and on the Middle East provide not only insightful and nuanced diagnostics of the complex intersecting power configurations and dynamics within the region, but the analysis and interventions might contribute to developing the strategies and tools to counter authoritarian, sectarian, and militaristic politics. And at the same time, I argue that it is high, and it is the moment, in my view, that we abandon simplistic, essentialized notions of Western feminism, just as we have been challenging essentialist notions of Middle Eastern women and Middle Eastern feminism. And I should say that, when I started teaching a class, initially it was, I think, at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. I was teaching a class at the time, it was called Women in the Middle East. And, I often would find that, after a whole semester of teaching, what I was thinking was sort of a nuanced approach to women and gender in the Middle East, I would, the final essays would still have sentence like, women in the Middle East are, or, Islam is oppressive of. Now these days, I don't find that. I mean, I didn't find that in my last year's teaching at SOAS. I don't find this now amongst my Brown students. But what I do find is often this a very caricature depiction of Western feminism, sort of Western feminism that tends to be conflated with liberal rights-based feminism. So I would say that I see that as part of my project now, to challenge that, as much as, of course, challenging still Islamophobic and Orientalist depictions of gender issues within the Middle East. Excuse me. So I would now like to start concluding my talk by sharing my reflections about transnational feminist solidarity in relation to the politics of gender. And here I would like to talk about ambivalence. And instead of associating ambivalence with sitting on the metaphorical fence, political apathy, and inaction, as we often tend to do, I want to suggest that it might be an opening and potential bridging space. My growing sense is that the current political and affective moment we find ourselves in calls for greater sensitivity to and acknowledgement of contradictions and uncertainty. At a time when we see excessive righteousness and uncritical dogmatic discourses across the political spectrum, overlaid by extreme polarization, as well as religious and secular forms of fundamentalisms prevalent across the globe, it has become increasingly challenging to recognize, name, and embrace complexity, nuance, and paradoxes. I've come to my current thinking, and I would say it's definitely thinking in progress, in the context of my academic and activist work and involvement in transnational feminist mobilization and knowledge production, mainly in relation to Iraq, but also Lebanon, and more recently, the Kurdish women's movement. And let me clarify, I'm not talking about some sort of postmodern nihilistic relativism of everything goes. When I'm researching or being involved in advocacy campaigns around gender-based violence in the Middle East, or the very real material consequences of imperialist, neoliberal, and neoconservative policies and interventions on gender norms in the region, I mean, I do not feel a sense of uncertainty when researching or being involved in activism linked to the more specific impacts of US-led military invasion. I mean, particularly, of course, I didn't feel an uncertainty in the context of the US-led military invasion occupation in Iraq, or the broader devastating effects of authoritarian repressive regimes in the region. I'm also not ambivalent in my diagnostics of multiple intersectional configurations of oppression and injustice. I clearly see agency and strategies of resistance at both individual and collective levels, particularly by women and LGBTQI people and groups. What I'm more uncertain is in translating my diagnostics and analysis into a transnational feminist politics and solidarity. I would also like to make it clear that I still find it necessary, as I did previously with my co-author Nicola Pratt, to analytically differentiate between transnational feminist politics and campaigns that are transnational in method, that is working across borders and nation states in terms of membership, networking, communication, and advocacy, but are not necessarily rooted in post or decolonial anti-imperialist global justice approaches. In other words, certain feminist organizations who are transnational in their methods are not necessarily transnational in their politics, working with neo-colonial, capitalist, and militaristic frameworks, policies, and agendas. A transnational feminist lens, politics, and solidarity is rooted in the recognition of the complex and intricate ways relations of inequality and injustice intersect and are constituted by each other, paying attention to the multiple ways heteronormative patriarchies are inextricably linked to other relations of domination, such as colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, and racism. Crucially, and that is often overlooked, these power configurations, as well as the various forms of agencies and resistances associated with and challenging them, are historically and empirically specific, changing, and require careful investigation. So, for example, in the Iraqi context, following the US-led military invasion of 2003, a transnational feminist lens and solidarity around the increase of gender-based violence required a recognition of the various ways patriarchal gender norms and relations had been impacted and transformed in the context of a changing political economy. This following 13 years of the most comprehensive sanction system ever imposed on a country, but also 35 years of dictatorship under the Ba'ath regime. The transnational feminist lens and solidarity required an engagement with the neoliberal and neoconservative policies imposed by the US-led invasion and occupation. But it also entailed paying attention to regional, national, and local forms of inequalities and marginalization, learning about the corruption of Iraqi politicians, political parties, and militia, divisive and violent sectarian agendas, as well as conservative gender norms cutting across secular and religious constituencies. More recently, and I've written about this previously, I have a sense that following almost 20 years after the invasion of Iraq, it is far too simplistic and reductionist to focus on the invasion and occupation, that is the US-led military interventions and neoliberal and conservative policies, in explaining the dire situation in Iraq, especially in terms of increased gender-based equalities and violence. Local and regional factors are often ignored, especially by US-based feminists who, for good reasons, focus on challenging US imperialist foreign policies, as well as racism and Islamophobia within the US. However, that on some occasions has led to tensions with feminist activists in the Middle East, who fear that US-based feminists might undermine their struggle to challenge more local forms of inequalities, including those linked to culture and religion, even if they might want to challenge Orientalist and essentialized depictions of culture. While all this might sound easy in theory, in reality and practice, however, transnational feminist politics and solidarity is often very difficult and might create turmoil as it requires painful decisions. Increasingly, I don't think that it's only a function of waning youth. I've come to see transnational feminist politics and solidarity as hard work, both in terms of effective labor and the dilemmas I'm facing, but also actually putting in the hours, doing the homework of educating ourselves about particular contexts at given specific moments, while also being aware of the histories of oppression and resistance underlying the present. Also, if we take solidarity seriously, beyond the mere impulse of a metaphorical standing in solidarity, if we want to translate a sentiment into practice, we are bound to take risks and make ourselves vulnerable. And I give you some examples. So in the 90s, when I was a PhD student at SOAS, I got involved in the British anti-sanctions movement. And at the time, the British anti-sanctions movement, sort of similar to the US-based anti-sanctions movement, was very much focusing on criticizing Western foreign policy, especially in terms of sanctions. But many of us of Iraqi background with connections in Iraq, who had experienced political repression under the Ba'ath regime, felt really uncomfortable with the way that there was a glossing over the political repression and the human rights atrocities by the Ba'ath regime in the context of British anti-sanctions campaigning. So a few of us in the 90s put together a group called Act Together, Women's Action for Iraq. And that put us in tension with sometimes the broader anti-war movement and British anti-sanctions activists. So that, that was a time when, I think for the first time I was sort of confronted with this politics of sort of standing in the middle. And that then I think was sort of really highlighted in 2005 when I was invited to the last in a series of world tribunals on Iraq in Istanbul, 2005. And, at the time I was at Exeter, and I was still involved with Act Together. And I was supposed to speak the last day. There was 3 days, and everyone who was talking the first 2.5 days was either starting or finishing the talks by saying, we have to support the armed resistance against US imperialism. Now, this was 2005. This was at the height of sectarian tensions, but also almost on a daily basis, if not weekly basis, you had these bombs going off at marketplaces, on streets, killing Iraqi civilians. And when it was my turn, I was supposed to give a talk about the impact of the occupation, of the invasion and the occupation on women and gender in Iraq. I started my talk by saying, I can't stand in front of you and say we have to support the armed resistance, because of the way that the insurgents or resistance, however you want to think about them, was killing innocent Iraqis. And the room, and this was in Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, it was quite hated at the time. And I wrote a piece called "The Enemy of My Enemy is Not My Friend." And I feel like that was a really difficult political moment. Again, sort of trying to straddle. And, there were people who accused me of being a CIA agent. So that was quite hard. Now then, a few years later, in connection with, trying to do something more practical, I felt like I had spent time just sort of trying to raise awareness about the impact of sanctions and then war and occupation on women and gender, and that at some point just didn't feel enough anymore. And so I got involved in several projects with Iraqi women's rights activists to try to sort of contribute to skill training in terms of qualitative research. And the idea was that activists who had sort of found evidence or sort of anecdotal evidence that there was an increase in gender-based violence, that they would be able to translate that into research that they could then use for policy purposes. So I did this for a while, but, at some point I found it really difficult because some of the organizations that I was dealing with, we're taking money from US aid or even some from the US Republican Party. And I kind of found that's really tricky to straddle. And this is, of course, in a situation where women's rights activists, some of them were risking their lives to challenge gender-based violence. But, I could tell that, some of the sort of funding agendas were quite problematic to my mind. So at some point I felt I had to take a break. And then more recently, and that's recently, I guess, this is very, I mean, this was just the last few years. So my a former PhD student of mine, now colleague, Isabel Kesa, who has just published a book about Kurdish female militancy amongst the PKK-led Kurdish women's movement. And I had done some work on the Kurdish women's movement. So we wanted to do some research on the concept of genealogy, which is often referred to as an alternative women's science or women's paradigm, which has been at the center of the PKK-led Kurdish women's activism, including international solidarity campaigns. And there are a range of different definitions and understandings, but it is clear that genealogy is essential to the vision, the struggles and campaigns of the Kurdish women's movement. And what Isabel and I wanted to do was to further our understanding of the complex and diverse meanings attached to genealogy, and also understand the role the concept plays within the wider political struggle of Kurdish women. We were attempting to productively engage with the ethical dilemma of being committed to a transnational feminist solidarity that acknowledges the importance of the Kurdish women's political struggle and knowledge production, while also critically exploring the premises and assertions that underlie conceptualization of genealogy. Now, we were both conscious of the ethical dilemma we face as feminists exploring claims pertaining to exceptionalism and innovation by a movement in acute and ongoing struggle. And we were hoping that it was possible to adhere to principles of transnational feminist solidarity and simultaneously engage critically with some of the claims made by the movement. But I would say that's probably, I don't like to speak in terms of regrets, but I think that's probably the one project where I regret that I got involved with, and I probably consider it a failure. I mean, I think there are certainly things that Isabel and I could have done and should have done better in terms of the methodology. But I think what I learned is that it is really, really difficult as a non-Kurd in this situation to engage critically. And I'm sure there will be some questions about this. But I'm aware of time, so I want to conclude, and I want to say that I am aware that recognizing nuance and complexity and taking a nuanced position that is not an either or is not the same as feeling uncertainty or having contradicting sentiments. However, in my own experience, the two are linked. And the point I'm trying to make is that forceful expressions of certainty of how to tackle, resist, and ameliorate specific situations of gendered inequalities and forms of injustice frequently emerge in the discussions and debates I find myself involved in, often with apparently devastating polarized oppositions. And I'm not talking about the kinds of polarizations between right-wing fascist politics and those of the more progressive spectrum, but within progressive feminist politics. Yet in my view, it is essential academically, politically, and personally to continue to not only try to bridge our different ways of thinking, but also to conceptualize our various approaches and emphasis in terms of a continuum rather than fixed and insurmountable differences. The attempt to reflect, mediate, and possibly even bridge requires us to recognize that our political positions, analysis, and ways of approaching our research findings are linked to locations, contexts, particular histories of oppression, as well as specific histories of resistance and struggle. At the same time as acknowledging that we all tend to react in critical manner to prevailing discourses and representations around us. One of the problems of imposing closure and being filled with unshattered conviction is that it stops our ability to think through and experience inconsistencies and discontinuities. Righteousness and certainty hinder us to ask questions and reflect critically on political positions of movement we aligned with or what we have come to hold. Fixity forecloses a widening of horizons. Personally, I have learned that it's okay to say, I don't know, at times, not resting in that position, but trying to use it productively, embracing the ambivalence I might feel about something, possibly adding a healthy dose of humility, which might be construed as weakness, but in our attempts to engage in transnational feminist solidarity might be the wiser move. Thank you.